Hi everyone, this is Andrew Prima, a Ukrainian American reporting from Kiev. In today's podcast, this is week 139 of Russian invasion of Ukraine, and this is the last week of October 2024. So, the US elections in a couple of days, and the new president can change a lot in the world order and affect the war in Ukraine. So we're going to talk about is it the time for negotiations and when we can sit down and make a peace. The US elections are approaching and the war dynamics show it's time for negotiations. The Ukrainian armed forces barely holding its positions and Russia has shown more success in taking over more villages in Ukraine and wants to get the whole territory of the Luhansk region and Donbas region as well in order to start some kind of negotiations. To have any prospects for negotiations, at least about the freeze of the conflict, the enemy must first be stopped. This is a fundamental task, President Vladimir Zelensky said, and there will be no territorial concessions from Ukraine. And he confirmed that. This is a response to posts that have already appeared recently. In particular, the most resonant about Trump's alleged peace plan in the Financial Times. And this edition is informed, and I think at least partially, but it reflects the proposals that are currently being prepared in Trump's headquarters. For now, this is an unofficial position, but there is a partial reference to statements previously made by the Republican vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance that Ukraine will have to abandon NATO. And there is a precisely it's a precisely about a certain territorial concessions. Therefore, it can be said that Zelensky, albeit not directly, answered J.D. Vance and those circles around Trump who want to propose such a peaceful compromise that will not entirely correspond to Ukrainian interests. But what should be kept in mind? There are very important nuances here, in particular in this statement. Of course, and I think that this is such a fundamental red line for us, Ukraine will not agree to recognize the occupied territory as Russian ones. And I think, first of all, this is exactly what President Zelensky had in mind. This is a really principled position for us that in 2014 and in 2024. Another thing that can happen in the future, especially if Trump becomes president, is a situation where we as Ukrainians will be offered to agree simply on the concessions of hostilities, cessation of hostilities on the front line, what is often called freezing. This doesn't mean that we are giving up territories, but de facto we are forced. Maybe we will agree to cease fire. But here, the problem is Putin. And now there are also a lot of publications and statements that Putin is not gonna agree to some kind of freeze, to some negotiations with compromises options to end the war. He wants to get more. He wants to get more of Ukrainian territories. And Putin's traditional style, in particular in negotiations. He can go to negotiations, but to such negotiations where he will pressure the other part by military means. This was the case during the Minsk negotiations both in 2014 and 2015. This is Putin's favorite style to pressure militarily and force the opposite side to make concessions in his favor. Otherwise, he will threaten to go further, to size more. Therefore, this scenario is quite risky. That is why President Zelensky suggested to our partners to change the situation, to increase pressure on Russian dictator to respond to force with force. So far, unfortunately, the US and some European partners are not ready for such actions. They're afraid of escalation of the war, although the escalation is already happening. It is creeping escalation, I would say. There were already several waves of escalation earlier. In the spring, when there were attacks on our energy system, and then an offensive in the Kursk, in the Kharkiv region, where the Russians were bombing the city with gliding bombs. Now, rather, it is creeping escalation, but it is no less dangerous. So, now you have to think about how to stop the enemy. This is the main goal now. In order to have any prospects for any negotiations, at least about the freeze of the conflict, the enemy must be first stopped. This is a fundamental task. Otherwise, any negotiations that someone will initiate, it doesn't matter Trump, China, India, whoever might go on Russian terms, which will be very problematic for Ukraine. There is no pressure on us from European partners. If we don't talk about Viktor Orban or Robert Fico, who are who are not partners of Ukraine, rather they are on own among strangers among our own, but among influential Western politicians, no one pressures us. Among another thing is that advice on statements that is will be necessary to sit down at the negotiating table and and heard from time to time from such a leaders, such a German Chancellor Scholz, and some politicians such as the Minister of Defense of Italy. In Europe, in fact, among the current leaders, except for Scholz, we don't know much people who would actively advocate the start of negotiations. And the same Scholz doesn't put pressure on us at all. Scholz has a dual position, by the way. It is to help Ukraine, but at the same time, he's increasingly talking about negotiations with Russia. It seems to us that this is not so much pressure on Ukraine as a demonstration of one's commitment to peace negotiations. Shorts work in this way for the domestic political context, given that Germany will hold parliamentary elections next year, and the main risk of coercion, namely coercion to negotiations, will come from Trump. This is the main factor that can influence. The issue of security guarantees will be one of the key ones. The Ukrainian side violates it periodically. That is why the topic of invitation to NATO arose, because, in the opinion of both Zelensky and many Ukrainians, even the majority, if we take into account socialist polls and the positions also dominate among political elites, the best guarantee of security is membership in the NATO, but it can be at best after the war. And if Trump becomes the president of the United States, there may be a situation when we will be offered not just a freeze of the war, but also rejection of NATO. But then we should insist on bilateral guarantees, in particular from the United States. This will be very difficult to achieve, especially under Trump. Even the current Biden administration is not very ready to guarantee us anything for sure. But for us, this is a fundamental question for today, and this will be one of the key issues in further negotiations. Regarding the borders of 2022, the head of Zelensky office, Andriy Yermak, said this recently in one of the interviews. But I will act as a cynical pragmatist. I don't see any reason why Russia would withdraw to this point. Yes, for us, there is only the international recognized borders of 1991. However, the proposal about the boundaries by February 24, 2022 was at the negotiations in Istanbul. The Ukrainian side proposed this, but Russia never answered. In the end, these negotiations ended with nothing, although Ukraine was then ready to make concessions. Among other things, it was about giving up the prospects of membership in NATO, but in exchange for the fact that the Russians would leave. But they didn't leave. They partially left the northern part of Ukraine under our pressure, but they stayed in Kharkiv region. They stayed in the south. And I'm not talking about Donbass at all. I don't see the prerequisites at all. If they didn't do it then, why would they do it now when they're progressing at the front lines? I have a truly little faith in this scenario. That's why it's really, it doesn't make sense to talk about the borders of 1991 or 2022. This is a beautiful position. I understand why Yermak said this. This is also our negotiating program, perhaps. Although our program is a maximum and a strategic position not only now but in the future, it is in particularly a formula for peace and the return of Ukraine to internationally recognized borders. Even if there will be no kind of freezing of the war in the future, Ukraine will not abandon this position. That is, we will not recognize the occupied territories of Russia, but when we talk about 2022, I think raising the stakes ahead of future negotiations. Russia is also raising the stakes. The former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, despite his loud statements, will not influence the negotiations. But both Putin and Sergei Lavrov periodically say, let Ukraine give us Zaporizhia, Kherson, give up NATO, and so on and so on. That is, both sides raise the stakes. But at the moment, there are no negotiations. I think that there will be an attempt to start negotiations only if Trump wins the election. At the moment, I don't see readiness on both sides for serious, let alone parity negotiation, especially from Russia. There was also a request from Ukraine to the United States to provide Tomahawk missiles in a closed part of the victory plan, which President Zelensky presented to President Joe Biden in Washington in 2021. By the way, at the Sea Breeze exercise, the USS Ross, an Allied Burke class guided missile destroyer in the United States Navy, had 90 Tomahawk cruise missiles at that time. American sailors actually made a few comments on how effective this weapon is, and they said that only one volley and the Black Sea of Russian Federation, Black Sea Fleet of Russian Federation, will be gone. This is so unofficially off the record, as they say, but this is the but they confirm that these missiles could really solve the issue of our victory quickly enough. The situation with Tomahawk missiles is complicated and has some nuances. This is a secret appendix to the third point of President Zelensky's victory plan. It's not a weapon of war now. This is a clause about deterrence, about the fact that we had weapons that we can use as a deterrent against the escalation of the war on the part of Russia. In fact, we, for example, the Americans agreed, then this information should have been made public so that the Russians knew that there was such a weapon that it could be used. But there was a purposeful leak from the United States, and the White House did this. And I think to show that Ukrainians are asking for that, but we cannot give that weapons to them now. We don't know if Tomahawk missiles will be given to Ukraine or not. This is the first reaction. In November 2021, when Ukraine asked for Stingers, it was told that it was impossible. This is the first time we have heard that it is impossible. Then we also heard about the supply of weapons Western armored vehicles. We see that American armored vehicles already rolling around the Kursk region and they're successfully extinguishing Russian positions. That is, nothing is impossible. What we are told today is impossible, but tomorrow it might be possible. But we need to work with it, and to uh, we need to convey them that is not the only necessary for us, but it also for them. I understand why it struck Zelensky so unpleasantly. There was some disrespect here, so there was a disrespect for Israel as well as for younger partners. However, we cannot abandon the US partnerships. We must maintain this partnership no matter what. But such public criticism is in principle correct, so that such leaks of information do not become a current practice. We need to confirm that we have our own principles and positions, and we don't want our partners, even those of whom we depend, to neglect our interest and our trust. I hope that the right conclusions will be drawn from this incident. The Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland, Radosław Sikorski, said that the Polish government has proposed a defense loan for Ukraine. He said that if Ukraine wants weapons, it could buy these weapons from Poland on credit. With the grants, it will be possible to correct our bilateral relationships gradually, but this reaction of the Poles manifests a certain selfishness. By the way, this is what you should expect from newly elected President Donald Trump. He already spoke about it publicly, and the Poles simply played ahead. They have now proposed what Trump is likely to do if he becomes president. That is, the US can continue military support to Ukraine but on credit, and the Poles also show a certain selfishness in this sense. But this is okay. We need these weapons. Sometimes it's not about how we purchase or how we get those weapons. Most of the time, it is important how quickly we can get them at the front lines and defeat the enemy. There is another approach here. One thing is the year 2022 when we had to help uh, and stop the enemy because the risks were significant. Then the Poles helped free of charge because they felt it was in their national interest as well. And now, perhaps they think the situation is problematic and challenging, but not as critical like it was in 2022. They count money, like everyone else. So there is a politics here and a certain manifestation, of such arrogance. And this is not quite the right position and not entirely friendly. In fact, we will still have to restore a real strategic partnership to counter Russian aggression. It's just inevitable. And the current position of the Poles it seems to me incorrect. But again, that's okay. If we had the opportunity to get as many weapons on credit as possible and at the right moment, probably Ukraine would be in a way better position than it is now. Thank you for listening. If you like my podcast, please share with your friends.